left my son playing right in front of the house, and I was watching him through the window while he pushed his small toy car back and forth across the concrete. And everything looked normal in that moment until I turned away for less than a minute to get a glass of water from the kitchen. When I came back to the window, the spot where he had been playing was empty, and the toy car was still lying on its side in the same place. But he was gone, without a sound or any sign of where he went. I opened the front door immediately and stepped outside, and the street was completely empty, with no cars passing and no people walking. And the silence felt wrong because it had been noisy just minutes before. I called his name again and again while moving farther from the house, and my voice echoed against the walls. But there was no answer and no movement anywhere around me. I started knocking on neighbors' doors one by one, and they came out confused. And within minutes, several people were helping me search the street and nearby alleys. But we found nothing at all. I checked every corner near the house, including behind trash bins and inside the small storage shed. But there was no trace of him, and nothing seemed disturbed. Time kept passing while the light outside began to fade, and I could feel that something was wrong inside the house, not outside. And that realization made me turn back toward the front door. I walked inside slowly, and I noticed that the back hallway door was slightly open, even though I always kept it shut. And that was the first detail that didn't make sense. I pushed the door wider and looked down the narrow hallway that led to the basement stairs, and the air felt colder there, and the light didn't reach the bottom properly. I stepped closer to the stairs and saw that the basement door itself had marks near the lock, like it had been forced open recently. And I knew then that someone had been inside. I went down the stairs carefully, holding onto the wall, and each step made a faint sound that echoed louder than it should have in that space. When I reached the bottom, I saw him lying on the floor, completely still, and his small body was positioned near the center of the room, as if he had fallen there suddenly. I ran to him and shook him, but there was no response, and his skin was cold in a way that made everything around me feel distant and unreal. I noticed large footprints around him that didn't belong to anyone in the house, and they were clear enough to show the pattern of heavy work boots. I stood there staring at those prints, and I understood immediately that someone had come inside while I was gone for that short moment. I went back upstairs slowly, closing the basement door behind me, and I didn't call anyone because I knew I had already seen everything I needed to understand what had happened. I sat in the kitchen and forced myself to remember every person I had seen near the house in the past few days. And one face kept coming back clearly in my mind. There was a man who stood outside often, pretending to smoke while watching the street. And he had been there more than once at the same time my son played outside. I also remembered a worker who had been doing maintenance near the house a few days earlier. and he had worn the same type of boots I saw in the basement. I left the house immediately and went to find him, and it didn't take long because I knew exactly where he had been working. When I reached him, he looked at me and froze for a second, and that hesitation told me more than anything he could say. I confronted him directly, and I didn't stop talking until he started to break, and his words came out uneven and fast as he tried to explain what happened. He said he saw my son alone and decided to go inside. And when my son ran toward the basement, he followed him down without thinking about what he was doing. He admitted that he grabbed him to stop him from screaming, and that moment lasted too long. And then everything went silent in the room. He tried to leave quickly after that, but I didn't let him finish because I already knew what I was going to do next. I didn't give him time to react, and I hit him with everything I had until he fell to the ground and stopped moving, and the street around us stayed quiet like nothing had happened. I dragged him back toward my house step by step, making sure no one was watching, and it took longer than I expected because his weight slowed me down. When I got inside, I locked the front door behind me and pulled him through the hallway toward the basement stairs, leaving marks on the floor that I didn't bother to clean. I pushed him down the stairs carefully so he wouldn't wake up too soon, and his body landed at the bottom near the same spot where I had found my son. I went down after him and tied his hands and feet tightly, using whatever I could find in the room, making sure he wouldn't be able to move even if he woke up. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked around in panic, and he immediately understood where he was and why he was there. I stood in front of him without saying anything at first, and then I told him exactly what he had done in that same room just hours earlier. He started begging and trying to explain again, but I didn't respond to his words because I had already heard enough. I left a small container of water near him, but I gave him no food, and I walked back upstairs and locked the basement door behind me. The first night, I could hear him shouting and hitting the door from below, and the sound carried through the house until it slowly turned into weaker attempts. The next day, I went down to check on him, and he was still awake, but his voice had changed, and he spoke slower while asking to be let out. I told him that my son had no chance to ask for anything, and then I went back upstairs without waiting for his answer. Each day, I repeated the same routine, and each time his movements became smaller and his voice became quieter until it was barely noticeable. The house stayed silent most of the time, and I stopped opening the windows because I didn't want any sound from inside to reach the street. After several days, I went down and found him lying in the same position without moving, and I watched closely to see if there was any sign of life. There was nothing at all, and the room looked exactly the same as it had the first time, except now both of them had died in that place. I turned around without touching anything, and I walked back up the stairs slowly while holding onto the wall for balance. I closed the basement door carefully and made sure the lock was secure again, and I didn't open it after that. I cleaned the hallway and removed any marks that were left on the floor, and I made sure the house looked normal from the outside. Days passed, and no one asked questions because no one had seen anything unusual, and the street returned to its normal routine. I stayed inside most of the time, and I avoided looking at the basement door whenever I walked past it. Everything ended in that room, and no one ever found out what happened after I walked back inside that day. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.